Good morning. I'm James Kaplan. I'm a partner with McKinsey and Company in New York and co-lead our Cloud by McKinsey initiative. Mark, you want to introduce yourself?
Happy to, James. Mark Gu here. I'm an associate partner with McKinsey out of our New York office.
Okay, and we're here this morning to talk about the $1 trillion in potential value of cloud and how to capture it. And before I pass off the presentation to Mark, I just want to talk a little bit about the context for the research which McKinsey did on this topic. First of which is, we've been spending a lot of time with large institutions thinking about what has and hasn't been successful in cloud. And it's increasingly clear there's a tremendous opportunity for cloud value from business acceleration, from improved resiliency, from increased agility, from improved developer productivity. However, many institutions are not capturing it. This is understandable. Cloud is almost a business model change. Unfortunately, at least a significant number of companies have treated cloud adoption as a technology initiative, or even more so, a data center or infrastructure initiative. The next generation of virtualization or data center automation. And it's becoming increasingly clear that thinking about cloud as a technology initiative which will optimize technology cost only gets you so far. You really have to understand the business value of cloud and use that to help make the business case for the investments, the architectural changes, the foundational services, all the efforts required to fully exploit and take advantage of cloud. So therefore, we wanted to take a look at the use cases that are creating business value and get a sense of how much that could be in aggregate. And it looks like so far, it could be more than $1 trillion in incremental EBITDA for Fortune 500 companies by 2030. And I think Mark would like to very much to talk to you about the research we conducted and the findings that came out of it. Mark, you want to take it away?
Thank you, James. Yeah, so building on what James is talking about, right? We started this research looking at, right, what is the value of cloud across business and technology for the Fortune 500 out to 2030. And in our research, we focus really on what is the EBITDA value, right? That is the bottom line value to enterprises for the top Fortune 500. I think what's really interesting at the top level is we found that there's really 3 buckets of value. On the left-hand side, you'll see what we call rejuvenate, right? This is what most folks think about the value of cloud when they start. This is about IT cost optimization. This is about risk reduction to the business. This is about optimizing the operations, right?
And the one thing I just like to add that by no means is it only or even primarily about IT cost optimization.
Absolutely. The second big bucket is really about innovation. How do you leverage the cloud to drive innovation, whether that is new business, new analytics capabilities, new automation and IoT capabilities, right? Leveraging this hyper scalability and the speed of the cloud to capture that value. And then the third bucket we looked at is pioneer. This is really on the cutting edge. Concepts like quantum computing, like virtual reality, like blockchain, 3D printing, that is at the cutting edge of technology. And how does cloud enable that opportunity? Our research found that across all 3 buckets, we can quantify about $1 trillion of EBITDA value out to 2030. I think what's even more interesting is that, as you can see here, only about 40% of that value is in rejuvenate, that first bucket, right? And that's usually the bucket that most enterprises are focused on today. The big majority of the value is actually in innovate, right? About 770 billion in EBITDA. And there's likely even greater value in pioneer, but that's an area that's so far out there that's hard to quantify, but really could define some industries in the future. Okay. I think another really important point to note is that this is not going to be something that lifts all players. This is going to be an area where some enterprises that take advantage of cloud are going to capture more of the value, and frankly, some that are going to be, not capturing the value at all. And that's really the competitive angle here that enterprises need to watch out for. Let's take it further down into the details here. So when we look at once again, the three buckets on the left-hand side, we went even further into what are the specific value drivers that lead to this overall value. And as you can see here, even in Rejuvenate, the IT cost optimization, that first row, is actually a small part of that value. What's really interesting is, for example, business resilience, the ability to reduce business downtime because your systems are more stable and don't go down as often through cloud, is actually the biggest bucket of value there. And also row 3, which is core operations digitization, right? The ability to use cloud technology to automate and digitize your operations, a significant chunk of the value. Similarly, in Innovate, what we actually did was we looked at 750 use cases, whether it's analytics to automation to IoT, across these industries. And we figured out how much of that value can be attributed to cloud. Right? How much can cloud accelerate the capture of those use cases? How much can cloud enable the scaling of those use cases? And we found significant value there. Overall, this is about, as we mentioned earlier, $1,200 billion, right? About 1 trillion EBITDA. And as a percentage basis, it's about 20% plus EBITDA improvement. That's a very, very significant uplift that frankly any CEO or CFO should care about. Okay. Another angle we looked at in the research, which to make it very relevant for specific industries, is to look at the EBITDA impact by industry. You see on the left-hand side here, everything from high-tech oil and gas to electric power and natural gas, right? The utilities players. And I think there's a few things that really stood out. Number one, the EBITDA impact by industry varies. What you'll see is some industries, for example, high tech, absolutely are going to be completely transformed by cloud, and in fact are already far along the way of doing that. Particularly given, for example, the COVID situation that's driven a lot of remote work and the need for digitization in software. Followed by industries like oil and gas, insurance, banking, retail, healthcare. There's a substantial amount of EBITDA impact there because there are such core industries with substantial opportunity to leverage things like analytics and automation, so on and so forth. Right. What we've also done on the right-hand side is actually looked at the specific split by industry, and we go even deeper in the research on specific use cases that business leaders can act on. This really provides a very detailed roadmap for business leaders and technology leaders to come together and say, how do we get started in cloud because to identify and capture the most value. Talk about one more piece to bring this to life. Across each of these three buckets of value, we've actually already seen leading players really take advantage of cloud. Right? For example, in Rejuvenate, we see pharma companies, we see consumer goods companies, we see financial services companies leveraging the public cloud to drive technology cost savings as well as operational savings. In Innovate, we see auto manufacturers, payment processing players really use modern cloud technology to drive supply chain optimization through cloud to drive real-time payments and better user experience. And finally, in Pioneer, we see telecom companies and financial analytics providers really leveraging data lakes in the cloud to provide new capabilities in customer insight, right? New business opportunities in new markets through Pioneer Tech. So that gives you a flavor of the value at stake here and the $1 trillion of EBITDA value that's up for grabs across all of these industries.
Mark, why don't we pause here and see if there's any questions from the audience? Please put them in the chat. Okay. Maybe we'll keep going, and as ones come up, we'll address them. But please, we'd love for this to be an interactive dialogue. We'd love to hear what questions folks may have.
Maybe, James, let me pass it on to you to talk a bit about how we see enterprises starting to capture this value and some of the lessons learned, as well as how we would suggest the best way to capture it.
Okay. The level of frustration with cloud programs is high, right? The old joke about soccer in the United States, it was the sport of the future, and it always would be. I wouldn't quite say that about cloud, but there were times when it felt like, there have been times over the past decade where cloud was the technology operating model of the future and seemed intent on staying this way. And, if you look at large, complicated institutions, Fortune 500 companies, especially ones in regulated industries or ones that have stringent uptime and resiliency and security requirements, there's been less progress over the past 5 years than we would have hoped. It's picking up, but there's less progress than we would have hoped and would have expected. And, we'd say that more than half of programs are delayed by at least 6 months. More than half of programs don't get the business impact they've experienced. The large majority of programs experience higher IT costs. And there's some underlying drivers there. Largely speaking, too narrow a conception of what a cloud program can and should be. Not enough change to the operating model. To Mark's point, not enough focus on where the true business value lies, right? Too much lifting and shifting without architectural remediation. And so as a result, that makes it harder to make progress. Should we go on to the next slide?
Yes, James, maybe we pause. I'm seeing we have a couple questions.
We do.
Yes.
Mark, do you want to answer the first couple of questions?
Sure, happy to, James. So I think the first question that was asked by a member is, what are the skills and capabilities required to enable a cloud transformation within an organization? I think that's a fantastic question, right? And it's because the skills for cloud are fundamentally different than those skills that typically you find in an IT organization or a business today. The most important concept is really shifting toward engineering skill sets. Traditional IT skills, for example, system administration, are highly manual and really you think of them as kind of click ops, right? People are clicking through screens, they're using and they're operating in the data center. When you move to the cloud, it's much more of a software engineering mindset, right? How do I engineer services and leverage services in the cloud so that they're more resilient and provide the business capabilities? That's a big shift. And we often see in many organizations that is a critical enabler, right? Being able to retrain or recruit new talent to operate in the cloud is absolutely important.
I would say, Mark, if I could interject, you're seeing almost a complete reversal of some of the assumptions that existed about technology or IT organizational talent strategy a decade ago. And I know of many large organizations that said, development or technological implementation is a commodity that we'll try to source from the lowest cost potential provider. And the people we want to retain are project managers and business analysts and what have you. And, you really saw, I think this was insane at the time, but even more insane now, right? You saw a hollowing out of many IT organizations and an inability to drive technological innovation. Many IT organizations I know of are saying that, to Mark's point about engineering skill sets, they want 80% of their staff committing code in some way, shape, or form. And that's not just the development teams. That increasingly infrastructure, as people move away from ClickOps or move from what I describe as a ticket-oriented operating model to an API-oriented operating model, that much of what the infrastructure and the security teams do is engineering and automation and committing code as well. The one other thing I would note about skill sets, and this is related, is the importance of product management and product ownership as a skill set. And there's been a lot of work for business-focused products, whether it's a mortgage origination product or a customer care product, as application development teams have sought to, organize around a product operating model. We'd argue that, a product operating model is equally important for cloud, and that increasingly you want to think of it as everything as a product. Mark?
Thank you, James. I'm seeing a couple more questions. Maybe we'll take two and then we will continue. Second question is, what are the risks associated with a large transformation? And what are you finding are the typical challenges most organizations face? Okay. Once again, another great question. And I think, James, as you noted, right, this is a very relevant issue given the high percentage of failure or program stall that we see. I think there's a few common archetypes of risks that we see with large cloud transformations. Number one, a few years ago, many organizations thought, hey, we can just lift and shift, quote unquote, our way to cloud. We take what we had in the data center, we move it to cloud, we get the savings. That just simply has not panned out, right? The fact that the engineering
skill, virtual machine running in someone else's data center doesn't work any better than your cruddy non-standard virtual machine running in your data center. Sorry, Mark.
Exactly. And so I think number one is just making sure that's a risk, right? And being very crystal clear on what is the value in going to the cloud, as we've noted here, it's business and IT, and what's it going to take, right, beyond just lifting and shifting is absolutely important to recognize, right? I think there's also some organizations that have almost gone the opposite way, which is they've really locked it down. They've said, okay, we're only going to the cloud with these controls, very stringent kind of top-down mandates, et cetera. And that's caused kind of program stall, right? Because at the end of the day, one of the core values and benefits of the cloud is you allow greater experimentation. You allow the use of external services, right? Leveraging the innovation. And some organizations have taken kind of the same mentality that they've had operating in their own technology environment and applied it in the cloud. And that just has really not allowed them to capture the value, right? The benefits.
Yeah, there's
any other
risks I wanted to speak to. The first of which is a security risk, which is real. We've spent a lot of time looking at cloud security, and we've not found, many, if any, examples of underlying services from the CSPs, the cloud service providers, being technically compromised. We find lots and lots of examples of breaches and vulnerabilities caused by misconfiguration. That services are used or configured in an insecure way. And and to Mark's point, trying to get on top of that can very much stop a cloud program in its tracks. The only way to reconcile the two things is by what we call security as code or policy as code, where you write your security policies in such a way they can be applied programmatically, and you can test to make sure they're being applied as services are deployed in an automated fashion. The second risk I'd like to address would be a regulatory risk, which actually I think is more complicated than than the a security risk, because regulators, there's a different set of standards and a different set of applicable regulations for each industry. Certainly in some industries like financial services, different examiners may have different postures or different with different financial institutions. And let's face it, case law here is still a little bit unclear. The regulation is still, the regulators still figuring out exactly what the right boundary lines are, given the relative novelty of doing sophisticated things in the cloud in many industries at scale, and the highly dynamic nature of the underlying technology environment. The third risk I'd talk about is vendor lock-in, which I know of no small degree of debate. Couple of thoughts on that. One, listen, we all deal with vendor lock-in. We dealt with it on-prem. You might, just because something was running in your data center didn't mean you didn't have lock-in with your OS provider or your database provider or what have you. Now it gets perhaps even a little bit more complicated off-prem, because you don't have the option of skipping an upgrade cycle as a form of leverage. However, we're seeing almost no, or we have not seen much in the way of sort of real-time cloud bursting across platforms. It's not clear how practical that is for most workloads. And also, you give up a lot in terms of access to differentiated or innovative services. So at least the biggest institutions are trying to mitigate the risk of lock-in by having a portfolio of providers. But again, I think most institutions acknowledge, they lock in that vendor dependency is just one of those things you manage in enterprise IT, just as you managed it in an on-prem, or have managed it for decades in an on-prem type of environment.
Great, James. I'm seeing a couple more questions, but perhaps let's talk a little bit about how we have helped organizations really address some of these risks and really accelerate their cloud adoption.
Okay.
And then we can come back to, I think, some of these questions that get to that.
Well, actually, one of the questions I think very much tees up slide 7. There's a question around how can companies leapfrog or a typical cloud implementation roadmap? How do you think about this? And so page 7 is our model for an implementation roadmap or a cloud implementation program. And the underlying, there's a couple of underlying thoughts here. The first of which is a cloud adoption program or a cloud transformation program is almost the opposite of a data center migration. Data center migration often is a very waterfall, deterministic effort. It's sort of a forced march over 2 years. You do a baseline, you identify what your move groups are, you identify the dependencies, and on, right? And that, is painful and expensive, but has worked for most institutions that needed to do it. We'd observe that cloud is much more dynamic, much more dependent on business change for value, and requires much more of an operating model change inside and beyond IT to capture the value. It's in many respects much more agile in nature rather than a waterfall. So we see cloud programs as a series of loops, right? First on the inside, there's 2 parallel loops around business domain adoption and the building of foundational capabilities. So in terms of business domain adoption, that's all about, okay, what pieces of the business do you want to transform? Is it the wealth management business, an insurance? Is it the direct-to-consumer business? And what are the journeys that would benefit the most from increased resiliency, from improved developer productivity that allows you to implement more new features for the same amount of money, for increased agility that allows you to improve your release velocity from massive analytics that cloud can enable. And then what's the technical deployment and migration patterns to support that? If you want a certain degree of agility in a customer journey for the applications, that support that customer journey, what's the level of remediation or refactoring required as you move to the cloud to provide the value you want? At the same time, in parallel, you want to be building a set of foundational capabilities. Your services and architecture. What are the landing zones? Is there a virtual machine-based landing zone? Is there a container-based landing zone? What are the cross-cutting services that will be used across landing zones? What's your model for doing security and risk management? What are the policies you need? What should be encrypted? What should be, where do you need two-factor authentication? And how do you translate those policies into hard-edge standards that you can automate into the provisioning of systems? And how do you apply FinOps to continuously optimize the economics? Because your unit cost for a given application on day 180 could be a heck of a lot better than your unit cost on day one. And then all of those need to be synchronized within what we call strategy and management. What's the business model and plan, right? And how much and how quickly do you want to move to the cloud? To what what level of investment and what level of bubble costs are you willing to accept? How do you sequence the program, and how do you assure the relevant change? And then what's the operating model you want to put in place? Now, this is in aggregate, a tremendous quantum of change. Mark, anything you'd add to this?
Absolutely, James. And I think actually one of the questions is really spot on, which is, what do you typically see a company should not bring to the cloud, or they should be reluctant to? And I think that gets to some of the heart of this, which is, you have to really look at why you're going to the cloud. To James's point, right, the strategy management and the business domain adoption, kind of taking a business lens to figure out what makes sense to bring to the cloud versus not. For example, if you have a business process or a underlying core application that's stable, that does not experience a lot of change, where you're just trying to optimize the cost, it may not be it might not be first priority to quote unquote move to the cloud, right? So there's real decisions that have to be made about the level of ambition that you want, right? And where to prioritize the investments and where to get started to get the most value quickly.
The couple of points I would add is, if you were building a business de novo, there's relatively few opportunities to do that. But assuming in this case, if you were building the business from scratch, you'd probably build just about everything in the cloud, right? There's I think, except for maybe a couple of edge cases, there's no reason to believe you'd build very much on-prem. However, most of the time we're not dealing with a greenfield. We're dealing with a brownfield with existing applications. And our take is you have to look at the interplay between business values and business value and existing architecture, right? So how much business value is there from the agility and scalability cloud provides versus how much architectural change will be required? And there are some really interesting corner cases there. For example, Monte Carlo risk analysis in investment banking, tremendous ROI, right? Because the value is clear from being able to do even bigger and more extensive risk analytics, and the complexity in most cases of transitioning that type of architecture to the cloud is relatively low. In contrast, as Mark points out, if you have a business process that's stable and is working well and it doesn't need to change a lot, right? And there's, a relatively older application architecture that isn't easy to migrate to a cloud, that may not be the biggest priority. And, again, we suggest filtering decisions about what to put in the cloud through the lens of business value rather than through the lens of we want to get out, in most cases, through the lens of, we want to get out of a data center. Considerations are a little bit different if you're looking, if you have an older data center that, you have to either get out of or make a large investment in. But in many cases, or quite frankly, most cases, business value trumps a facilities costs in terms of the economics of moving to cloud.
Great. I think there's one other question that we haven't captured here, which is simply, what surprised you most doing this research? And I'll offer my thoughts, but James, I welcome yours as well. I think at the high level, look, we going into the research, we felt that the business value of cloud had not been really thought about or really looked at as much as, say, the IT cost piece, right? So we kind of came into that research with that hypothesis. But I think the sheer magnitude, right, $1 trillion EBITDA value for the Fortune 500, and the split of that value, right, with most of it being kind of on that innovation side, I think that was quite surprising. And I think that's got some pretty significant ramifications for, how enterprises and how business leaders think about cloud, right, as a business transformation, not as purely IT, and where they invest and the size of those investments. Because if there's truly that much value out there by industry, there's significant opportunity to invest in cloud and to really outcompete, the competition. James, would love your thoughts as well.
Yeah, I mean, a more tactical thing for me. In retrospect, it's obvious, but I probably would not have guessed the potential value from increased resiliency. Now, if you think, in retrospect, it's logical, given the cost of downtime in a call center or the cost of downtime in an order processing system, right? But I was quite taken by the extent to which the resiliency the cloud provides can reduce the business cost of downtime.
James, that's a great point. I think many folks are so used to kind of the data center model and presume that, hey, it's resilient and good uptime, and presume that, hey, cloud might actually be more challenging. But what we did find was well-architected cloud environments can actually reduce downtime. It can reduce the number of incidents, right? You're engineering the services to be more stable and to self-heal in many cases. And absolutely, right, that is a massive amount of value relative to the cost of IT. Perfect. Let's see if there's any other questions. Otherwise, I think it's been an awesome discussion. I really love the questions that were asked, right? And to find out more, right, we have at McKinsey a cloud practice called Cloud by McKinsey. You can visit us on cloud.mckinsey.com, right? Check out our insights. We have new insights coming up every week, and excited to be of help to you. Any other closing thoughts, James?
We thank everyone for joining us today.
Fantastic.